I stepped off the bus like a ghost returning to a town that no longer remembered me. The air was thicker than I remembered, warm and stale, carrying scents of dry grass and rusted metal. I stood there for a long moment, the diesel fumes fading behind me, as I stared down the stretch of road I hadn't seen in 60 years. I was 70 now, too old to be chasing ghosts. But still, there I was, returning to the place where my story began, and where, in some way, I had always left a part of myself behind. The town hadn't aged well. The buildings sagged like tired elders, and the corner store where I used to buy penny candy had its windows boarded up, graffiti scrawled across the walls like a scream nobody heard. The sidewalk was cracked and overgrown, but my feet knew the way like they had muscle memory. Every step stirred something in me, gravel shifting not just underfoot but inside my chest. There was a tree halfway down Holloway Street, an old oak that used to mark the start of our block. When I was a kid, my father built a swing on one of its branches. I paused there now, fingers brushing the bark like I was trying to connect to something long gone. The swing was gone, of course. The tree looked smaller, somehow. Or maybe it was just me who had grown too big, too far away from where I came from. I felt something tighten in my throat when I saw the rooftops of the old houses. Ours had the red shingles, the ones my mother insisted on because she said they looked like they belonged in a fairy tale. I hadn't seen that roof since the summer I left, angry and bitter, 17 and sure I knew better than the world that raised me. I hadn't spoken to my father since. He died 10 years after I left, and I hadn't even come back for the funeral. That shame never softened. But grief has a way of waiting. It doesn't age or move on. It just settles like dust in the corners, waiting for you to come back and notice it. I wasn't sure what I expected when I finally decided to return. Closure? Forgiveness? Some answer I didn't even know how to phrase? But as I stood there, staring at the outline of the house I once called home, I didn't feel ready for any of that. I just felt old and small. I took the long walk anyway. The road curved just like I remembered. The Harper place was the last house on the right, surrounded by a leaning fence and a yard that once held marigolds and mint. My mother used to say those were the kinds of plants that could thrive in poor soil. Survivors, she called them. But there was nothing left now. Just dry earth, scattered leaves, and a porch that sagged under the weight of years. Still, even in its ruin, it looked like it had been waiting for me. I paused at the edge of the gate, rust flaking beneath my palm. My breath caught. I could almost hear laughter from another time, my sister's giggles, my father's deep voice calling me in before dark, the clatter of pots and pans from my mother's kitchen. The scent of cornbread and sweet tea ghosted through my memory, so vivid it made my eyes sting. That house held all of it. The joy and the ache, the love we didn't know how to keep. Time erodes places, but not memory, and certainly not regret. I pushed the gate open. It creaked in protest, like it hadn't been touched in years. Maybe it hadn't. My steps were slow, reverent. The porch groaned beneath my weight as I approached the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't been ready to admit until now. Whatever I found in there, or didn't, this was the beginning of something I couldn't turn away from. Not anymore. The door opened with a stubborn groan, the wood swollen from time and weather. It resisted me at first, like the house wasn't sure if it wanted to let me in. I paused in the doorway, the scent hitting me all at once. Dust, old wood, and something else I couldn't quite place. Not rot exactly, more like memory. It had been 60 years, but I could still trace every line of this place in my mind. The way the floorboards creaked in the hallway, the soft hum of the ceiling fan that used to lull me to sleep in summer. The front room was smaller than I remembered, but then again, I was just a boy when I last stood there. The furniture was gone, or maybe had been cleared out long ago, but the impressions were still there. The faded outline on the wall where my mother's clock had hung, the worn patch on the floor where my father's chair used to sit. I walked in like I was trespassing on sacred ground. My footsteps echoed too loudly, swallowed by the silence. It was overwhelming. Every room I passed was full of ghosts, not the kind that haunt, but the kind you ache to see just one more time. My mother humming in the kitchen, my sister braiding her hair in front of the mirror, my father, stern and proud, sitting at the kitchen table with a newspaper and a cup of black coffee. I could see it all, and none of it. I ran my fingers along the wall as I passed the hallway, there, where I used to mark my height in pencil every birthday. The markings had faded, barely visible, but I found them. My initials, small and crooked, next to a line drawn in my father's steady hand. He had always called it the wall of proof. Proof I was growing. Proof we were here. Now it just looked like forgotten scribbles in a house no one cared for anymore. The bedroom doors were shut. I didn't open them. Not yet. I wasn't ready to see how empty they'd become. Instead, I found myself drawn to the stairs. They creaked louder than I remembered, each step a protest, each one daring me to go back, but I didn't. I reached the top, and it was there, in the hallway, our family photo still hanging crookedly on the wall. The glass was cracked through the middle, but I stared at it anyway. My younger self, wide-eyed and fidgeting, my sister beaming with her front teeth missing, my mother's soft smile, and my father, tall, proud, unreadable. That picture was the last time we'd all been in the same room. Christmas, 1964. I must have stood there 10 minutes, just staring. My fingers hovered over the frame, wanting to fix it, but I left it crooked. It seemed honest somehow. Real. That night, I lay on the floor of what used to be my bedroom. I didn't unpack anything. I didn't even take my shoes off. I just lay there staring at the cracked ceiling, letting the silence settle over me like dust. I hadn't cried since my wife passed 3 years ago. But something cracked open in me. Maybe it was the stillness. Maybe it was the weight of so many years never grieved. Or maybe it was the realization that even if you come home, home doesn't always wait the way you hope it will. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I dreamed. It was my father's voice, not loud, not harsh, just a whisper that wrapped around me like a blanket. Look where no one else will. I sat up, heart pounding. The room was dark, but the voice lingered. I'd recognize that voice anywhere. I hadn't heard it in decades, but I knew it. He wasn't angry. He wasn't asking why I left or why I never came back. He was guiding me, still. My eyes darted to the ceiling. The attic. He'd told me stories when I was a kid about hidden places, secret messages, and how sometimes the truth hides in plain sight because it knows most people never look up. I lay back down, staring at the dark line of the ceiling again. Tomorrow, I would look where no one else had.
Morning came slow and gray, filtering through the warped slats of the bedroom window. I hadn't slept much after the dream. Not really. The voice lingered in my chest like an echo I couldn't quiet. Look where no one else will. My father's voice. Clear as if he'd been sitting beside me. I rose stiffly, the floor biting at my knees as I stood. The house groaned with me, its old bones adjusting to a weight it hadn't carried in years. My back ached, my legs protested, but something deeper pulled me. Something that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with obedience, respect. I hadn't obeyed my father much in life. Not toward the end, not when I thought I knew better. But this felt different. This felt like a final request. The attic. I stood under the hallway ceiling and stared up. The pull-down door wasn't visible. In fact, there was nothing in plain sight to suggest it was even there. Just old white paint and cracks like veins in plaster. But I remembered. When I was 10, I'd seen my father disappear up there once. No ladder, no noise, no explanation. Just him in the hallway, and then him gone. When I asked where he went, he said, "Just somewhere that keeps things safe." I never asked again. I walked the length of the hallway twice before I noticed it. A thin seam in the ceiling. Faint, deliberate. And there, toward the far end, tucked just above the linen closet, a small string, barely visible against the white paint. It swayed slightly, like it had been waiting to be seen. My hand hesitated mid-air. Something about touching it felt sacred. Like if I pulled it, I'd be opening more than a door. I'd be crossing into something I hadn't earned. But I reached for it anyway. The string felt brittle, but held strong. I pulled gently, and the panel creaked open with a sigh of old hinges. A wooden ladder folded down, each rung worn and dusty. It was darker up there than I expected. No window, no light, just a hush, like the attic had been holding its breath for decades. I climbed slowly, feeling the weight of the years on every step. The higher I went, the more it felt like I was ascending into memory itself. Dust danced in the air, catching the thin beam of light from the hallway below. The attic space was low-ceilinged, wide, and utterly untouched. And cold. Not in temperature, but in presence. Like time hadn't warmed this place in a long, long while. Boxes sat in crooked stacks, a moth-eaten blanket draped over something long and forgotten, an old trunk, a rocking chair, but nothing seemed out of place until I noticed the back wall. It was different. Slightly newer wood, not aged the same way. It didn't creak like the rest, and it had no dust. As I stepped closer, I could see the lines. A panel set into the wall, its borders precise, its surface oddly clean. My breath caught. I didn't know what I expected, but my heart began to pound. I looked for a handle. There wasn't one. But then, like before, I saw it. Another string. This one tucked beneath the beam, knotted and looped like a makeshift pole. My hands trembled as I reached for it. It felt wrong to be the one opening it, like it should have been my father or someone else. But I was here, and this moment had been waiting. I pulled. The panel opened with a soft click and a push of air that smelled like cedar, dust, and time. Behind it was a room. A hidden chamber. Small, square, quiet. Inside there was no clutter, just intention. A table with a stack of yellowed letters, bound in twine. A faded photograph of my parents on their wedding day. my sister's old teddy bear, missing one eye. And in the corner, a wooden chest with a small brass lock and a note taped on the top. The note said, "For when the silence ends." I sank to my knees. I didn't cry, not yet. There was too much wonder, too much reverence. This wasn't just storage. It was something sacred, a message, a trust passed down across silence and time. My father had built this room, and he'd built it for me. I sat on the floor of the attic for what must have been an hour, maybe more. Time slipped away, warped by the hush of that secret room. My knees ached, my breath came slow, and my fingers hovered inches above the chest, afraid to touch it, afraid not to. That note, "For when the silence ends," felt like it had been written yesterday, or a lifetime ago. Maybe both. The lock was small, brass, slightly tarnished. I expected it to resist, but when I gave it a gentle tug, it clicked open like it had just been waiting for my hands. Inside, the smell hit me first. Cedar, paper, something faintly sweet, like my father's old cologne. The chest was lined with blue velvet, and everything inside had been arranged with care. These weren't just keepsakes. They were fragments of a soul. On top, wrapped in a thin cloth, was a pocket watch I recognized immediately. My father wore it every Sunday to church, clipped to his vest. I thought it had been buried with him. Beneath it, a folded American flag, ironed, pressed, pristine. I never knew he served in the military. He never talked about it, not once. Then the letters. Dozens of them, maybe more, each sealed in separate envelopes, tied together with a thick piece of twine. On the top one, "To my children, when the time is right." I didn't open them. Not yet. I didn't feel ready. There were photographs, too, some black and white, others in faded color, family pictures I'd never seen before. One showed my parents sitting on the porch, smiling in a way I barely remembered. Another showed me as a baby, asleep in my father's arms. There was one of my sister in her graduation gown, beaming with pride. And there was one photo that stopped my breath. My father, standing in front of this very attic wall, before the false panel had been built, holding a hammer in one hand and a letter in the other. A date had been scribbled on the back, August 3rd, 1966. The year I left. It hit me then. He started building this room the year I ran away. When I turned my back on the family. When I thought he'd written me off. But he hadn't. He'd built this, not as a monument to loss, but as a vessel of love, of truth. This wasn't just storage. It was a legacy, hidden not to be forgotten, but to be discovered when the time was right, when silence had stretched long enough to teach me how to listen. I don't know how long I stayed there kneeling. Eventually, I sat back against the attic wall, the letters in my lap, the watch in my hand. It ticked faintly, still alive, still marking time. He had trusted that I would come back, someday. That faith gutted me. The kind of man who builds a hidden chamber in the rafters of his house isn't just preserving memory. He's preserving meaning. He's preserving voice. He's telling the world we were here, and what we felt mattered. It was getting dark. I hadn't eaten. I hadn't spoken a word out loud since arriving. But something inside me was wide awake. The attic didn't feel so cold anymore. It didn't feel haunted. It felt held. As I climbed down the ladder with the first letter in hand, I understood something for the first time in my life. My father hadn't been waiting for my apology. He'd been waiting for me to be ready. And now, I was.
I sat at the old kitchen table the next morning, the same one my father built from oak, the one where we ate Sunday dinners and argued about grades and chores. The wood was scarred now, faded and chipped at the corners, but it held. Like everything else in this house, it had endured. The first letter trembled in my hands. The envelope was yellow, the ink faded but still legible. My name, Daniel, written in the same firm handwriting I'd once seen on report cards and permission slips, on bills and birthday cards. Seeing it now, after all these years, felt like time bent inward. I broke the seal. My son, if you reading this, then the silence has lasted longer than I ever wanted. I don't know what brought you back here, but if it was pain or guilt or grief, I hope this helps. I am not writing to correct you. I'm writing to tell you what I never could when you were young and I was too proud. This house was built with my hands, but it was always meant for you and your sister. Not just the walls, the stories, the truth. I couldn't breathe. My throat tightened around something heavy and unfamiliar. I read on. Being a black man in this country means carrying weight in your chest that no one sees. Sometimes I carried that weight in silence. Other times I passed it down without meaning to. I was hard on you, Daniel. Not because I didn't love you, but because the world outside our door was harder. I needed you to be strong. But maybe I didn't teach you how to be soft, too. I folded the letter and laid it gently on the table. My hands covered my face. The tears came quiet, slow, not from pain, but from recognition. The man I had feared, resented, run from, was also the man who wanted to protect me from a world that might chew me up. There were more letters, one from my sister, one marked, "To be read after I'm gone." Another simply said, 1971, that night. I opened that one next. You remember that night when you screamed at me in the driveway and left with nothing but a backpack? I remember too. I stood at the door for an hour after you disappeared, not because I was waiting for you to come back, but because I couldn't move. I wanted to chase you, but my pride was louder than my love in that moment. I lived with that shame. I clutched the letter to my chest. 60 years had passed since that night. I hadn't even turned around. I thought he let me go. But he stood in the doorway, frozen. I had no words, just a silence so full of meaning, it felt sacred. The more I read, the more the man I remembered began to change. He was no longer the figure looming in my childhood memories, stern, distant, hard. He became layered, complex, human. He wrote about his time in Perea, about working double shifts in the factory to keep the lights on, about how he and Mama stayed up at night wondering how to keep us fed without letting us know we were poor. He wrote about racism, about quiet humiliations, about standing in line behind white men half his age and watching them get chosen for promotions he trained them for. But we made it, didn't we? He wrote. We made something whole out of something broken. And I wanted you to know that even when I didn't say it, I was proud of you. I still am. By the time I finished the fourth letter, the sun had shifted across the kitchen floor. Light spilled in through the window, casting long shadows across the table. I felt like I'd been excavated, like each word he had written had pulled a piece of me out from where I'd buried it.
This wasn't just about my father anymore. It was about legacy. He hadn't preserved these words for comfort. He preserved them because he knew our stories were not safe in the world. They had to be guarded, passed down intentionally, not whispered, but kept. There was a note folded with the last letter I opened that day, a smaller piece of paper, barely larger than a receipt. If these words find you, then the silence ends with you. Do not let it return. I held it in my palm, staring down at the quiet command written by a man who had long since gone to rest. And I made a decision. This story, our story, would not stay in the attic.
I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the letters beside me, stacked like a heartbeat on the kitchen table, wrapped in twine again, not to hide them, but to hold them with the care they deserved. I paced the halls of that house like it was a chapel. Every creak beneath my feet felt different now, not like a collapse, but a call, a whisper beneath the floorboards. Don't let this die with you. My father's voice was quiet, even in ink, but the echo of it was enormous. By morning, I knew what I had to do. There was a museum on the far end of town. I remembered when it used to be a run-down courthouse, back when segregation was still the law and not just a memory. They'd turned it into a small African-American cultural center. Modest, underfunded, always at risk of being forgotten, but it was still there. I walked in clutching a shoebox filled with carefully retied letters, a few photographs, and the pocket watch. I didn't call ahead. I didn't plan what to say. I just showed up with trembling hands and an urgency I couldn't name. A young woman sat at the front desk, probably in her late 20s, headphones looped around her neck. She looked up and smiled politely, probably expecting me to ask about hours or directions. I cleared my throat. I think I have something that belongs here. Her smile faded into curiosity. You're donating something? I placed the box on the counter like it was made of glass. My name's Daniel Harper. My father built a house just past Holloway Street. Inside it, he left behind a story I think people need to hear. She blinked. What kind of story? I opened the box and carefully laid out the top letter. I didn't say anything. Just let her read. She took her time, and I watched her shoulders slowly shift, her eyes soften. The weight of it landed. When she looked up, she didn't speak right away. Then she whispered, This is incredible. More staff gathered. They took turns reading parts aloud. No one raised their voice. It was like a sacred ritual, a remembering. They asked me questions about my father, about the house, about my sister, my mother, the history wrapped in the folds of the letters. And then finally, the museum director appeared, a man in his 60s, wearing a bow tie and a look of quiet reverence. He held one of the photos to the light and then looked at me with tears just beneath the surface. Mr. Harper, this is not just a family archive. This is American history. Personal, honest, unfiltered. This is the kind of story we need. They offered to catalog everything, to create an exhibit, not flashy, not sensational, just honest. A room in the back wing, walls lined with the letters, the photographs, the pocket watch beneath glass, a tape recorder, maybe. My voice, if I wanted to read the letters aloud for others to hear. I stood there, surrounded by people I didn't know, feeling something I hadn't felt in years.
Peace. Not the kind that erases pain, the kind that honors it. I agreed. They asked me if I'd be willing to write a short introduction for the exhibit, a message from the sun to the world. I nodded. But later, when I sat down with pen in hand, I didn't know how to begin. How do you compress 60 years of silence, longing, and discovery into one page? Eventually, I wrote this. This isn't just my family story. It's a story about fathers who were hard because they had to be, and sons who didn't understand until it was too late. It's about the truths that get buried in old houses and the power of writing things down so they don't disappear. My father built a home, but more than that, he built a memory. This is that memory, made visible. Please read it with care. When I handed the page to the museum director, he placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "You've given something rare, a voice that time tried to swallow. Thank you for bringing it back." As I stepped out into the sunlight, something inside me settled. The weight hadn't disappeared, but it had found a place to rest. I walked home slowly, back to the house, back to the attic. But this time, I wasn't searching anymore. I was returning with a promise fulfilled.
The next morning, the house felt different. Not newer, not repaired, but alive in a way it hadn't been since I was a child. I walked through it slowly, barefoot, letting the coolness of the floorboards meet my skin. The air felt softer, like the silence wasn't bearing down on me anymore, but wrapping around me, gentle, forgiving. I made myself a cup of coffee in the old kitchen. The pot still worked, surprisingly. I drank it black, the way my father used to. The bitterness didn't sting like it did when I was younger. It felt honest. After breakfast, I climbed the attic ladder one last time. This time I didn't hesitate. The hush of the upper room greeted me like an old friend. The chest remained open, its contents slightly shifted from the museum visit. A few letters still remained, ones the staff wanted me to decide on, whether to keep them private or share them later. But I wasn't up there to read or decide. I was up there to thank. I sat down in the same spot where I had first opened the chest, palms on my knees, spine straight, breath steady. The late morning light seeped through the attic slats, casting stripes across the floor. "I understand now," I whispered into the stillness, "and I'm sorry it took me this long." It wasn't dramatic. There were no voices, no creaks, just peace. That room had always been more than wood and storage. It was a time capsule of love my father didn't know how to say out loud, of the history he feared would be lost if he didn't carve out a space to preserve it. A room he built not because he expected praise, but because he hoped someone would come looking when they were ready. I sat with that truth for a long time. Eventually I stood and walked to the secret panel, the one I had pried open in awe just days before. I reached out and closed it gently, pressing the wood back into place until the wall looked whole again. But this time it didn't feel like hiding. It felt like blessing, a benediction. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was sacred. I climbed down the attic ladder for the last time, folded it up, and pushed the ceiling panel closed. The cord swayed for a moment, then settled, like the house exhaled. In the hallway, I paused beneath the family photo, still crooked, still cracked. I ran my fingers along the frame, then gently nudged it into alignment. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. Downstairs, I gathered the remaining letters I hadn't shared and placed them in a drawer with care. Not to hide them, just to keep them close.
Some stories are meant for the world. Others are meant to be read slowly, over time, by the hands that carry them. Later that afternoon, I stepped onto the porch. The sun had shifted, casting gold across the yard. A soft breeze rustled the brittle grass. For a brief moment, I swore I could hear my sister's laughter down the road, or maybe just the memory of it. Either way, it didn't make me sad. I looked back at the house, peeling paint, leaning gate, sagging steps, and I saw none of that. I saw a man who built something that outlived him, and a boy who finally came home to understand it. For the first time in my life, I felt the boy and the man in me meet, and they were both grateful.
I woke early on my final morning in the house, long before the sun had risen. The sky outside the window was still a deep indigo, a quiet hush blanketing everything. For a few moments, I just lay there, listening. Not for sounds, but for what had changed inside me. The stillness wasn't lonely anymore. It was full. I moved slowly through the house, pausing at each room, letting my eyes settle on the chipped corners, the faded wallpaper, the places where life had once pulsed. I touched the doorknobs like they were relics, touched the windowsills where my sister and I used to press our faces, waiting for our father to come home from the factory. In the hallway, I found one last mark I hadn't noticed before. Under the pencil lines that tracked my height, smaller and nearly erased, were the initials D.H., carved deep into the wood. I smiled. I had no memory of doing it, but the shape of the letters told me it was mine, a little boy needing to prove he existed. I whispered to that boy now, "You were never forgotten." In the living room, I stopped in front of one of my old childhood drawings, framed and faded, still hanging by a crooked nail. I remembered the day I made it, a house, a tree, a family with smiles too big for their faces. My mother had said, "It's a masterpiece," even though it was just scribbles. I left it there. I didn't need to take anything with me. By the time I stepped outside, the sky was soft and gold, the morning light stretching across the cracked sidewalk. I stood on the porch and looked back one last time. The house didn't look empty anymore. It looked full of voice, full of memory, full of meaning. I closed the door gently behind me. As I walked through town, the bus stop in sight, I felt something unfamiliar. Lightness. Not because the past had disappeared, but because I'd finally stopped running from it. At the edge of the street, I turned toward the hilltop where the museum stood. It was quiet at this hour, but I imagined the letters resting behind glass, the photographs carefully arranged, the old pocket watch ticking behind its protective case. I imagined someone walking through those halls, young, curious, unaware, and stumbling upon my father's words. "If these words find you, then the silence ends with you." And maybe, for them, the silence would end too. Because this wasn't just a story about a house. It was a story about voice, about remembering, about turning back just long enough to carry something forward. As the bus arrived and I climbed aboard, I pressed my palm against the window and watched the streets blur into motion. I didn't know if I'd ever come back, but I didn't need to, because the house, the story, the legacy, none of it was lost anymore. It had been found, and more than that, it would be heard.